The Prime Minister heads overseas today. Justin Trudeau will be talking trade and migration in Peru before continuing on to Europe. He's likely hoping this trip goes better than his last one to India. We'd like to hear from you about this particular tour. You can submit questions through Facebook and YouTube. We'll put the details up on the screen for you. Right now, though, let's go to CBC's Hannah Thibodeau, who is live in Ottawa. What is the Prime Minister looking to get out of this trip, Hannah?
I think it's just what you said there, Sue Hannah. I think the Prime Minister is hoping that this could potentially be a redemption tour, since his last one in India in February was such a disaster for him. You're not going to see the cultural or touristy things like you did on that trip with his family. In fact, there won't be any family traveling along with him on this one. He has 5 cabinet ministers traveling along, and I think part of the focus, or the main parts of the focus for this trip, it's getting investment in Canada, building those agreements with world leaders. Also, everything from talking about the G7 summit that's coming up ahead in Canada, in Charlevoix, Quebec, in June. So preparing for that. And also, there are going to be a lot of talks with world leaders, other world leaders, about Canada attempting to get that UN Security Council seat in 2020. So those are some of the discussions that will be happening. A lot more focused on the economy, getting investments in Canada as well. Trudeau will be in Lima, Peru. That's for the Summit of the Americas. That's for 2 days. And you can probably, I just want to tell everybody what that really loud noise is. There's a Hercules that's leaving just beside me, so that's why it's a bit loud right now. We are on an active runway. You can see the Prime Minister's plane behind me. So when he leaves, he's going to go to Lima, Peru for 2 days for the Summit of the Americas. Then he's going to go to Paris for an official visit where he'll meet with the President of France, Emmanuel Macron. Of course, the subject of Syria is likely to be on the table at all of these different stops. And then finally, his last stop will be for the Commonwealth in London, England, where he'll have an audience with the Queen as well as a one-on-one with British Prime Minister Theresa May.
And Hannah, could you just get them to turn those engines off for a minute?
Yeah. I'm trying, Susanna.
Listen, we can hear you just fine. We are already hearing concerns, though, about the timing of this trip and whether it's appropriate given the drama unfolding around the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion. What's the latest on that, Hannah?
Well, we have heard some say that the Prime Minister should have canceled this trip. It's an 8-day trip. They're saying that he should be on the ground here dealing with this big domestic problem. The Trans Mountain timeline is ticking away. It's going to be May 31st, and some say that he shouldn't be off on this international junket while there's this constitutional crisis, as the Alberta Premier, Rachel Notley, calls it. So we heard from NDP leader Jagmeet Singh yesterday talking about this. Here's what he had to say.
We've got a very serious issue. We've got the finance minister talking about cutting transfer payments to fund essential health services. This is a crisis which requires the Prime Minister to deal with. The mess is created by the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister absolutely has a responsibility to be here to ensure that this doesn't continue and to stop all sorts of language and discussion that's going to continue division. The Prime Minister should absolutely be here to deal with this crisis.
The officials for the Prime Minister say that's just absolutely ridiculous, because he's going to be meeting with other world leaders. He's going to be meeting with CEOs on this trip. There are 2 international conferences taking place. They say he needs to be on this trip to try to get investment here in Canada. But not only that, they say that Canada needs to still continue to do its international work.
Now, Hannah, we've got some questions from the audience on Facebook and YouTube as well. And Tony Sloggett wants to know why the Prime Minister, in his words, is running when there are important issues here at home, like the pipeline. You've dealt with that, but there is one that perhaps is a little more facetious. Judith Mongrain asks, and I don't mean to put words into your mouth, Judith, but I'm reading your question here. She wants to know, what will he be wearing? This, of course, in relation to the kerfuffle over the family's garb when they were in India.
Yeah, I think that's something that Canadians really noticed on the India trip, as we heard from our viewer there, that he was wearing a lot of the traditional Indian clothing when he was on that India trip. And I don't think we're going to see anything like that. Like I had mentioned, there isn't a big cultural aspect to this trip. It's a lot of business, it's a lot of meetings with CEOs, it's a lot of speeches in front of youth delegates at all of the different events, and also, you know, he's going to have a private audience with the Queen. I don't think we're going to see anything like that. And as to, and I'm sorry, I forgot his name, who asked the first question about running from issues, as the Prime Minister's office would counter that, and I mean, I know a lot of people think that he's running from domestic issues. He is the Prime Minister of Canada, and that's what his office says, is that he still has to continue to go on these international trips and sit down with other world leaders to try to get investment in Canada. And I'm sure he's going to be asked that question by reporters on this trip, and we'll see what his answer to it. But I bet you that's going to be what it is. You can almost predict it. It's like, hey, I have to sit down, I have to get investment, you know, we can't just stay in Canada. However, there are a lot of people who are concerned about this Trans Mountain pipeline and getting it through, so much so, even the Prime Minister called an emergency cabinet meeting the other day. So we know there's great concern for it. He can, you know, we do have phones on the plane as well. They can still deal with domestic issues, but a lot of people feel he should be on the ground in Canada. Instead, he's going on this 8-day trip to 3 different countries.
All right, Hannah, that question, by the way, came from our viewer, Tony Sloggett, and we'll be watching for the answer, as you say, from the Prime Minister. Thanks for that. That's CBC's Hannah Thibodeau in Ottawa. Now, you can follow the rest of the live Q&A at facebook.com/CBC News and youtube.com/CBC News. And I hope you do put some more questions to Hannah, because she's there and she's ready for you. We are
Facebook viewers, I am now clear from CBC News Network, and we're going to continue to take your questions here before I jump on that plane to travel along with the Prime Minister on his 3-country tour to Lima, Peru. He goes from Lima, Peru, which is at the Summit of the Americas, then heads off to Paris, France for an official tour there. He'll be meeting with President Emmanuel Macron, and then finally the last part of this tour will be in London, England, where he meets with other Commonwealth countries. It's a Commonwealth meeting, but also he'll be having a private audience with Queen Elizabeth and having a one-on-one, face-to-face meeting with British Prime Minister Theresa May. So we hope you have a lot of questions for us. We don't have as much time today because of the fact that I do have to get on the plane, but let me bring in Chris Rance. You always see him when we do these Facebook Lives because he likes to read the questions to me. It makes it a lot easier, and sometimes he has a lot of knowledge too, and he can help us out. So Chris, what's our first question?
Well,
let's get right to them.
Hi Facebook fans. Margaret Marion Dag asks, is the Prime Minister taking his whole family again?
Oh, that's a really good question, Margaret. I appreciate that. No, he isn't taking his family with him on this trip. As you saw in the India trip, he did take his whole family with him, his wife, his 3 kids. But on this one, he is taking 5 cabinet ministers. Let me tell you who those cabinet ministers are. He's taking Chrystia Freeland, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Melanie Joly, as well as Catherine McKenna, Francois-Philippe Champagne, and Mary-Claude Bibeau. So 5 cabinet ministers will be on this trip with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. However, his family won't be traveling along with him on this 3-country tour. Okay. Thanks, Margaret, for the question.
John Larkin asks, why is the plane red, white, and blue?
The plane is red, white, and blue because it was painted in what year? Chris knows these things. It was painted under the Stephen Harper government.
About 4 or 5 years ago. And there are 5 Airbuses, and everyone except for this one were all painted what I would call extra dark, deep sea gray, low visibility gray. And I believe the Harper government wanted to have a more visible calling card every time they landed.
They denied that, though.
They did?
They did deny that.
Okay. Well, the point is, when you land at a summit and you see all the leaders' planes lined up, some of them are painted really dark gray, and some of them are in red, white, and blue, or blue and white as Air Force One is, and so on. So it is a more visible calling card. The Mulrooney old plane that this plane replaced was all white with sort of a red.
Taj Mahal.
No, that's the Taj. That's one.
the Taj.
Yeah, but before that, there was a Boeing 707, and it was all white with sort of a red ribbon with a lightning strike down the side.
See, if you want to know anything about the plane, Chris knows everything. He's really good at these facts. And it's quite interesting because when you land at these international summits, like we're heading to in Lima, Peru, it's exactly what Chris says. You land and each leader has a specific time that they have to land and they have to take off. And you come in and there's this long row of leaders' planes. It's something that we're lucky to get to see because we get to travel with the Prime Minister. So that's the reason for the color. We expanded a little bit more, gave you a little extra color on that one. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, and I'd wrap by saying Theresa May's plane, which David Cameron brought in, is actually still in sort of a low visibility, light gray sand.
See?
So
he
there you go.
knows all this stuff. It's so fun to have him along with me.
Thank you. So JF Derouleau says, Peru, I never knew our relationship with this country is so important. So maybe we should talk about the Summit of the Americas. Why Peru?
Yeah, this is the 8th Summit of the Americas. I just want to see. I want to double check my notes here, how often it takes place.
The last one I was at, it was Panama
Were you at the
City.
Last one?
Yeah, I was. And it was 2015, this time 2015.
In 2015?
Yeah.
So really, okay, yeah. So
early 2015.
Early 2015?
Well, it's around the time of my daughter's birthday, so I know that it was within a week or so.
Okay,
so it was in Panama City.
Right, it happens every 4 years. It's not just Lima, Peru involved in this, because this is the Summit of the Americas. This is 30 countries involved at the Summit of the Americas. And let me just give you a little bit of what they expected to happen this time around. We are starting to hear rumblings right from President Donald Trump, who was supposed to be at the summit, but abruptly pulled out because he says he has to deal with the Syria issue. Abruptly pulled out. We had heard that there might be some form of agreement on the NAFTA talks. That's not expected now because we know that if there's going to be some type of signing on this, Donald Trump wants to be forefront on this so he can say that there's been a success. However, in this case, one of the main focuses will be on Venezuela and the crisis, the political crisis that is happening there. Canada's been very outspoken on this, and we expect to see a unified voice in trying to potentially put more sanctions on Venezuela because they want to put pressure on them, political pressure. Those are some of the things. But not only that, when Canada goes there, Canada's holding the G7 in June in Charlevoix, Quebec. And there's going to be pre-talks about the G7 because many of these world leaders will be there as well. Let's be frank, when the G7 happens, everything has been agreed upon prior to the event happening. So these are talks that happen ahead of that, what type of discussions will happen, what type of agreements they can potentially get at the G7. And also, there are countries there that Canada needs to lobby in order to try to get that UN Security Council seat in 2020. So there's a lot of things for the Prime Minister to do when he's on the ground there, and being part of the Summit of the Americas is not just being in discussions with Lima, Peru, because there are 30 other countries who will be there as well. Thanks for the question.
So I should say that we're at about 10:40, so I think we can get one more question, and then we've got to use the camera for some pre-recorded reporter stuff, and
it's all the other crazy things. Yeah.
It's like the family minivan. It's getting used a lot today.
And Chris has to arrange all of us.
Yeah, I see Evan Dyer. He's right over there getting ready to...
Evan, come here.
Yeah, come on in.
Come
Say
on
hi.
in. So this is Evan Dyer. Of course, everybody knows Evan Dyer.
Well,
see? Evan Dyer, we're going to explain what we're doing. Evan Dyer is the TV reporter heading with us on this trip. I'm going to be doing radio. Chris Rands is not coming along. Too bad. I know. Another time. And we're doing a Facebook Live, so maybe Evan can add something to this one. Hold on a sec. So what's our last question?
I think the last question is Corinne Drescher asking, what's the total cost of the trip on behalf of taxpayers?
That's a really good question. And these are something that we usually do after the trip happens, because right now, each reporter and position on here, our company pays for us to be on this trip. This is not covered by taxpayers. This is paid for by the individual companies. CTV goes, Global goes, Canadian Press goes, Globe and Mail, etc.
At the same time, the Air Force salaries are already paid for because they don't get overtime, and it's the cost of the jet fuel, the hotel, And they're fixed costs and they're flexible costs.
So what we usually do when we come back from these trips is our very intrepid reporter, Dean Beebe, always A-tips and accesses the costs for these, so we can see if there are any extraneous costs, anything that taxpayers shouldn't be dinged for that they are. And I can't give you a full answer at this point because of those reasons. However, I think that gives a summary.
A-tip is access to information. It's one of our little acronyms we use around here.
Evan, do you want to add anything about the trip?
I think there's a cost in flying around the world for sure. That flying one of these planes costs thousands of dollars no matter where you're going. But as Chris said, a lot of the costs are fixed costs. The people who are traveling on this trip are being paid a salary whether they're in Canada or Peru. That goes for the flight crew, it goes for the politicians, and it goes for the staffers. It's even true for us, I guess. So the costs of these trips are not necessarily as high as the public might imagine. And of course, these planes have to be used. The flight crew have to fly. They have to get their hours. So.
That's one thing you may not know is these planes have to fly a certain amount of hours in order to stay active. Is that the right word for that, Chris?
Yeah. And one more thing I would mention about the plane is that I was on this plane in February, and it actually had its 39th birthday while we were in the air. So
Happy 39th birthday!
Yeah. We also saw a few mishaps. We had a stopover for some repairs in Rome. We saw a panel fall off the roof in the middle of the flight, actually, and the crew, though they're fond of the plane, were definitely
really looking forward to this now.
They wouldn't mind getting a new one at some point. So,
and we have heard that question asked quite frequently. Would the Prime Minister consider buying a new aircraft? They never answer that question.
Well, what they have said is because a couple of the Airbuses are used to refuel the CF-18s in flight, when they decide a new jet fighter, they want to decide the new transport aircraft. So anyway, we'll see. Okay. It's got a few years left. The crew is very diligent. They take care of everybody.
Excellent.
And we should wrap and get on to other things.
And this is what producers do. It's like, okay, reporters, stop talking. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop talking. I really appreciate all your questions today. Evan, Dyer.
Special guest star.
Special guest appearance by Evan Dyer and producer Chris Rands. I want to thank you guys all for joining Facebook Live. It was a lot of fun. You asked really good questions and hope we can do it again soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot. And thanks to Chris Patry, who's wearing his Olympic team jacket. He got to go to Pyeongchang. And Marc-Andre Hamelin on the truck. See you guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Just wait for it to actually be clear.